Wait, so just before we go over to Cenk, because you're shaking your head a lot, so I'm sure you've got a lot to say. But Destiny, do you think Israel are occupying Gaza?
I'm uninterested in the distinction. Some people will argue in terms of international law that for an occupation to be there, you require military troops on the ground to be running checkpoints and stuff. Other people say that even though it's not an occupation directly, it's effectively an occupation. I mean, to say that it's not an occupation, but the country around you literally controls your borders, your airspace, and basically everything that goes in and out of your country sounds kind of silly. So if somebody wants to call it an occupation, I'm not going to sit here and mince words over it. It's effectively an occupation. The only time this really matters is in certain international law. The ICJ is going to rule on things differently if they consider you an occupying power versus somebody that just has a blockade. So in matters of legality relating to international law, that might be an important conversation. But for the overall conversation, I would say effectively Israel's an occupying force of the Gaza Strip. Sure.
Cenk.
Yeah, so there's actually a couple of things I agree with Destiny on. One is the definition of occupying force and also the discussion of apartheid. Obviously, Israel's in control. They control the borders. They control the sovereignty of Gaza and the West Bank. And when you can cut off the water and the power to an area, you definitely control it. You can call it occupation. You can call it apartheid. You can call it anything you like. But the bottom line is Israel controls those areas and can do pretty much anything they like within those areas. So now when it comes to hey, why a peace deal with Jordan and Egypt and not the Palestinians? Well, and is it because the Palestinians are inveterate terrorists and they just can't help themselves and just want to do violence and terrorism, as opposed to the other lovely Arabs around there who desire peace? And Israel, the peace seekers, does it with all their other neighbors, but not Palestine. No, absurd. So number one, so it's not Destiny's not wrong in saying that Egypt said a lot of terrible things about Israelis and Jews, etc., and went to war and tried to execute those terrible things that they said. That's right. That's because, and that's why you make peace deals with your enemies and not with your best friends. We don't need to make a peace deal with your best friend. You need to make it with your worst enemy. And so, but the important part of that is that once they made the peace deal, it stuck. So the idea, the propaganda that the Muslims cannot make peace and that they are so violent they must be occupied ad infinitum, forever and ever, is absurd, right? So obviously Egypt made a peace deal, and despite all of the rhetoric, totally abided by it. In fact, part of the reason why Gaza is an open-air prison is, yes, Israel controls its borders, and Destiny is right that Egypt also doesn't allow the Palestinians to control their border on Egypt, but that's because of the peace deal that Egypt and Israel made, and Egypt is abiding by that, no matter how unpopular it is, even within their own country, because their own population hates the brutal occupation of the Palestinians. But nevertheless, the Egyptian government says, no, I will abide by what Israel wants because of that peace deal. For Jordan to make a peace deal with Israel, much easier. For the UAE or Saudi Arabia to make a peace deal, much easier, because they're not occupied and there's no skin in the game. There's the moral support that they'd like to give their Arab brothers, potentially, maybe, but it's a much easier lift. And these days, Saudi Arabia, UAE actually agrees with Israel on 90% of stuff anyway. The hard part is what happened to the Palestinians. And so I don't want to over belabor going back to the history of 1948, but it is important in this context. So when Israel started, they came in and they said, okay, we're going to take half this land. Now, at that point, was half the population Jewish or eventually Israeli? No, of course not. And so they took it by force. And yes, the United Nations said they're allowed to take it by force. But tons of Palestinians were driven from their homes that they actually lived in. And they were told, you no longer can live in your homes. No, this is now a Jewish state, and you Muslims are now second-class citizens, or you're driven from the land. And by the time we got to the Oslo Accords, Israel controlled 78% of that land. And so the Palestinians were like, well, okay. And they were ready to make a deal on the remaining 22%. But then Ehud Barak was like, no, I want more. I want you to be confined to maybe 18% or 16%. And the Palestinians were like, well, when are you ever going to be satisfied? And the reality is, I probably would have taken that deal because I understood that the Palestinians had no leverage at all. And with the awesome might of the American military behind Israel and our funding, that the Israelis were just going to grab more and more and more Palestinian land. And since then, that's exactly what they've done. So which leads to the last point for now, which is that, so they say, well, Gaza, we kind of left, and they don't have sovereignty. They can't control their borders, but they could govern themselves a little bit. And those sons of bitches still aren't satisfied. They don't have a state, but these unruly people will not accept being imprisoned, and they do violent attacks against Israel, so we hate them, and that's why we can't let them have sovereignty. But wait a minute, how about the West Bank, where they have actually abided by all of Israel's rules for decades now? The Palestinian Authority works along with the Israelis to enforce the occupation, yet Israel has still given them nothing, and the occupation continues, and it is obvious to everyone watching that Netanyahu and his government have no interest in peace, and they've stated it several times. The Israeli ambassador recently said, no, they are not looking for a peace solution, and they're not looking for two states, which means they're looking for permanent occupation, or perhaps one state where they drive the Palestinians into the sea. So there is no excuse for the occupation. The Palestinians in the West Bank have done everything right, and they're still enormously occupied, and the settlers grab more land every day, and they brutalize the Palestinians more every single day. So if Israel was actually willing to make peace, as Yitzhak Rabin was before he was assassinated, then they could get to a peace deal incredibly quickly.
Destiny?
Yeah, I disagree with almost everything. So first of all, the characterization of when we talk about the Palestinian people and why they don't want peace, this idea of like, are we being racist, or is it because we're Islamophobic? Are they just Muslims or whatever? I don't think any of that has a factor in here. And if you're analyzing the region and why these people don't want peace, I don't think that would be your driving force to saying they don't want it is because they're Muslim or because they're Arab. I think the problem is that the Palestinian people historically have been amped up by every single country around them for decades to fight for their entire country back. Every single country around this area was highly motivated in expelling all of the Jewish people out of Israel since the foundation of the country in 48. However, as time has gone on and as the Arab states have realized, well, I guess this is probably not going to happen, and as bilateral peace agreements have fallen between the Arab states and the Israeli country, yes, you're right, these peace deals, once they're made, they stick, but it's the other Arab countries that are making the peace deals. It's not the Palestinians. Egypt made peace, Jordan made peace, and we saw several countries under the Abraham Accords make peace, and once they did, Israel and those countries were chill, but nobody really seemed to bring the Palestinians along with them when the Arab countries were negotiating these peace deals, and the Palestinian people don't really seem interested in a peace. Seems like they're still interested in fighting, which is especially true if you look at who they consider themselves aligned with today, which is Hezbollah, Iran, and the Houthis, and then, whatever money they get shipped in from Qatar and whatever floats in from Turkey. So the allies that the Palestinians have today are more radical than they ever have been, especially the people that exist and operate out of the Gaza Strip, like Hamas or Islamic Jihad. So to say that like this is just a peaceful group of people that only desire peace or whatever is not necessarily true, but it's not because they're Muslim or because they're brown or because they're Arab or any weird reason like that. It's just because of the historical conditions that have led the Palestinian people to see Israel as an enemy that they could fight off if they just simply fought hard enough. I believe this is reflected in polling pre and post October 7th, where when you poll both Israelis and Palestinians, a majority of them in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and in Israel proper believe that if they continue to fight, the outcomes for them will only improve. That's a position that they still all have. So the idea that you can pursue a meaningful peace with a group of people that believes this is probably not true. When you talk about like Egypt enforcing their border and that's some part of like an Israeli peace deal, that is absolutely not true. Egypt has had their own issues with, for instance, supplying electricity and water into the Gaza Strip, where I believe in 2017 a big crisis was caused because Hamas stopped paying their bills on it. Egypt has wanted to keep that border secure because for historical and modern reasons, they do not like anything associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. And they don't like the fact that terrorists come from that region. And because even the modern Egyptian president has said that much like in the past with exactly what happened with Jordan and exactly what happened with Lebanon, if you let a bunch of Palestinian people cross that border and sit in your country, eventually they're going to use it as a staging ground for terrorist attacks, or they're going to try to coup you if you don't support their struggle, which again has historically been what Palestinian groups have done as they've moved out into surrounding countries. The current president of Egypt, El-Sisi, I don't know how to pronounce his name or whatever, has literally made this exact statement of being afraid afraid of Palestinians operating from the Sinai, which is, again, a legitimate fear. When we talk about like Ehud Barak wanting more and more and more during negotiations in Camp David, that is just not true. Everybody around the world, including all of the Arab leaders, were shocked because Arafat walked into those negotiations where people were praying that they would get 91% of the original land that they had in the 67 borders, if we go by that. And I believe by the end of negotiations, it was up to 95% with, I think, 3% land swaps, 1 to 3% land swaps. And by the end of the Clinton parameters in the Taba Summit, it was up to 90, I think it might have been 95 to 97%. But Arafat always walked away from the deal because he thought that if he fought, he could get more. And that has been the history of Palestinian negotiations with Israel. To say that if Israel wanted peace, they would simply have peace is just not true, because peace with the Palestinians has always been contingent on either a one-state solution or a bastardized two-state solution with an infinite right of return that would eventually become a one-state solution. And every single Arab leader in the region has balked at Arafat for walking away from things like Camp David and have been shocked that he didn't agree to any of these proposals. And yeah, I don't think there's been any sane person that said that that Arafat was negotiating in good faith for any of these deals. And the idea that Ehud Barak was the one who was walking away from it, or he was pushing for more, when he literally hinged his entire political career, along with Clinton to some extent, not as much for Clinton because he was a two-term president, right, on settling these peace deals, and then he lost afterwards, is I think, ahistorical. Yeah, when we look at the difference also between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, people will say like, well, the West Bank has been peaceful. I mean, kind of. There are terrorist attacks that originate from there. Hamas will even operate out of there at some points. But to say that like the treatment of the people in the West Bank is the same as the people in the Gaza Strip is just not true. The West Bank is not under the same sort of embargo or blockade or conditions that exist in the Gaza Strip, and that's for good reason. I think that if the people in the Gaza Strip were to chill, I think that you'd probably see conditions there be similar to the West Bank conditions, and hopefully some sort of negotiated peace agreement can be reached. But obviously there's a lot of issues with the Palestinian Authority, in that both Israel and the Palestinians don't seem to like them very much. And there's a lot of issues with Palestinian leadership. Historically, it was Arafat, and then from 2004 to modern day, it's Abbas. And again, everybody hates these Palestinian leaders for a variety of reasons.